You must consider yourself dead to sin and alive to God in Christ Jesus. Romans chapter 6, verses 8 to 11 emphasizes the transformative power of faith in Christ. It urges the believers to consider themselves dead to sin and alive to God. It highlights the believer's participation in Christ's death and resurrection through baptism, resulting in a renewed life lived in fellowship with God. In essence, it is a call to live a life reflecting Christ's victory over sin and death. The passage connects believers' spiritual death to sin with their participation in Christ's death and resurrection. Through baptism, believers are united with Christ in His death and resurrection, experiencing a new spiritual life. Paul asserts that Christ's death was a once-for-all sacrifice for sin, and His resurrection signifies His victory over death. By faith, the believers share in this victory, wherein we experience a freedom from the power of sin. The passage encourages to count your blessings and death to sin, but alive to God in Christ Jesus. It urges us to live a life that reflects new spiritual identity. This includes resisting sinful desires and actively seek to live in obedience to God. Baptism is presented as a powerful symbol of this transformation. It marks the believer's union with Christ in His death and resurrection. It is a visible sign of the invisible spiritual reality of being dead to sin and alive to God. The passage has practical implications for Christian living, wherein it encourages us to actively resist sin and embrace a life of holiness. It is a reminder that believers are no longer slaves to sin, but are free to live in fellowship with God. For centuries, the Catholic Church has celebrated the monumental event of Jesus Christ's resurrection from the dead. Without it, we have nothing and our faith is futile. But with it, we have a realm-altering, world-changing, hope-giving, life-transforming faith. New life is possible because of Jesus. His resurrection is the first resurrection, but we expect the resurrection of God's people and God's planet one day. The resurrection of Jesus is the centrifugal force that spins us out into a forever newness with Him. What does it mean Jesus' death and resurrection make believers dead to sin and alive to God? Jesus died to sin. He never sinned, but something changed in Jesus' relationship to sin when He died and rose. He left its realm. What happened to Jesus happens to each of us because He died on the cross. If we have trusted Him, our relationship to the domain of sin and death has radically changed. When Paul says we should consider ourselves as dead to sin and alive to God, he is saying that we have been transformed and transferred with Jesus from the realm of sin's power to life with God. Though as Christians we will often succumb to temptation, God sees us as dead to sin and alive to Him. Even though there will be countless moments when we will feel far from God and close to sin, Jesus has made us dead to sin and alive to God. Even though we often struggle to produce meaningful change and wonder if God is working in our lives or not, we are dead to sin and alive to God. And even though there are thousands of moments when we feel like we are being tossed in a deluge of evil, that God is galaxies away, we are very much dead to sin and alive to God. Let us consider ourselves to be radically connected to Christ's death and resurrection, making us dead to sin and alive to God. This consideration process will make the historical fact of the resurrection beautiful for our life today. We must pause to consider who we are. What happened to Jesus that changed us? The gospel has changed us. The true you is dead to sin and alive to God because Jesus Christ died and rose again.
I have been crucified with Christ. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no